Hi, everyone. So what I want to do in this video is go over basically chapters 6 through 11 to sort of provide an introduction to our short stories unit. We started with drama and then we switched to poetry. And now for the last half of the term, we are going to focus more on short stories. And we will be reading 5 short stories in total over the next 4 weeks. So this week, you'll have 2 stories assigned. They're both on the shorter side, which is why I put them together in 1 week. And then the following week, you'll have a 3rd story to read. The week after that, you'll read the 4th story. And the week after that, you'll read the 5th story. What I want to do in this lesson, though, since you haven't actually read any short stories yet, is provide you with a basic overview of things you should be looking for, things that you should be paying attention to and just considering as you read each of the short stories over the next few weeks. Okay. And again, this is just an overview. I just kind of want to hit on the highlights so that you'll know, again, not only what you should be looking for when you read them, but also you'll have a pretty good idea of what I will be focusing on in the follow-up lessons to each story. Okay, let's go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint here. All right. So it is a lot of slides. You'll see there's 40 slides, but a lot of those are just sort of segues into the next chapter. Each chapter itself only has a few slides of information for each one. But because I kind of designate when I'm moving on to a new chapter, it ends up being a lot of slides, but don't let that deter you. Like I said, each chapter is pretty quick, right? So go ahead and get started here. All right, so we're going to start on chapter 6. How do I read short fiction? All right, so let's see. This is sort of a chapter preview. We're going to be looking at structure. We're going to be looking at point of view. We're going to be looking at characterization. We're going to be looking at different literary techniques, some of which we also looked at with poetry. Foils, irony, images, motifs, symbols. Those are all things that we talked about in the poetry unit as well. So you're already somewhat familiar with those elements, and they will be, reappearing here in the short stories unit as well. And then we're going to look, of course, at theme, which we kind of dabbled in the poetry unit. We did talk about the theme of Dulce et decorum est and What Lips My Lips Have Kissed, but theme is going to play a major role in this short stories unit, right? So I'm probably going to go pretty quickly through some of these chapters and then really kind of focus on that chapter about theme. All right. So reading short fiction, you want to notice the structure. You want to think about the plot. You want to think about the conflict, the climax. And those are kind of, some terms that we used back in the drama unit as well, those 6 stages of dramatic structure. Those 6 stages of dramatic structure kind of appear here in the short stories unit as well. But the difference is that short stories can sort of play with the structure in different ways that you can't really do in drama. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that chapter. We're also going to talk about, how flashbacks and even flash forwards can make appearances in short stories. You want to consider the point of view. So when we talked about poetry, the point of view, we called that person that we hear speaking the lines of the poem, the speaker of the poem, the persona of the poem. When we talk about stories, both short stories and novels, we refer to that person as a narrator. And there are several different types of narrators that you might come across when reading short stories. So we're going to have a chapter focused on that as well. You have to consider the setting. right? You got to think about where the story takes place, when the story takes place, all sorts of things that, depending on the story, the setting could be a very integral part of how we're supposed to understand the story. There'll be a chapter on that as well. Characterization. We do not have a separate chapter on characterization. And quite honestly, I'm not sure why the book does that, but obviously when we are looking at a short story, we're going to have multiple characters, and it's important to think about what those characters add to the story and what they can reveal about the theme of the story. All right, so you want to think about, you know, what other people in the story are saying about each of the other characters, how they respond to each other. And then if we have a narrator that allows us to know a character's thoughts and feelings, we have to pay attention to that as well. Okay, so we kind of get into that with point of view when we talk about the narrator. We'll talk a little bit about how the narrator reveals things about the characters also, or doesn't. All right, we're going to look at some specialized literary techniques. Foils, you know, these are, you know, foils are sort of like the opposite of a character. So you have like your main character, and a foil to that character would be sort of a secondary character, a minor character. And by observing that minor character, it can reveal things we're supposed to figure out about one of the main characters. And they're often sort of seen as like opposite personalities, or they just have complete opposite behaviors. And that secondary character is likely supposed to get us to understand something about the main character. We have irony. Again, we talked about irony in the poetry unit. Irony is when, you know, the opposite of what we expect happens. And sometimes irony is hard in short stories because you don't realize it's irony sometimes until after the fact. You know, and that's why sort of going back and rereading certain sections or continuing to think about what you have already read can help you understand the story more as you continue to progress through it. We have foreshadowing. It's similar to irony in a way, in that you don't always know that it's happening when it's happening. But a foreshadowing is when a clue is sort of provided that, you know, lets us sort of know in a very subtle way what's going to happen next, or what's going to happen later in the story. And again, they can be so innocuous that you don't realize in the moment that it was foreshadowing. It's often not until we get to the big moment that we realize, oh, I should have known, like there were all these little clues along the way. That was on purpose. We're going to look, you know, about theme. You want to make sure that you are thinking about, you know, yes, the author has probably written this piece as entertainment, but there is likely an underlying meaning to the story, what they want the reader to walk away with. I don't want to say a lesson, because it's not always a lesson. It's not like we're supposed to always learn a lesson from the story. That's not quite the right way to think about theme. But it is something that we are supposed to gain from reading the story. Because obviously it's fiction, we're not gaining anything in terms of the actual story that was told or the characters that were written. We're supposed to gain something from the whole picture, what we're supposed to sort of walk away with. And you have to just keep asking yourself questions along the way to sort of get to that theme. All right, so some of the questions you can ask yourself as you're reading these short stories. Who is the main character? Does this person's character change during the story? Do you feel sympathetic towards the main character? What sort of person is she or he? Does that character have a foil? I will tell you, in the 5 short stories that we're going to read, we don't really run into any that use that foil. But we could have probably discussed foils back when we read trifles, because we do have some characters who sort of present opposite ideas. What pattern or structure is there to the development of the plot? Can you describe the way the events are organized? Is the structure significant to the meaning? And we will have a couple of stories where structure is pretty important, how the story is told. 3, does surprise play an important role in the plot, right? Is there a twist or a turn that you weren't expecting? Does the author use any kind of foreshadowing? Does the author use flashbacks, right? So think about how the story is presented. Is there anything in the story that's ironic? Is there any symbolism in the story? How does the author make you aware of any of the symbols in the story? How do we know they're symbols? What is the setting? Think about time and location. How important is the setting to understanding the theme? You know, some stories, the setting really isn't an important element. The story is happening. We might not even really know what the setting is. We could take that story and we could put it in a completely different setting and it would still play out the same way and we would still get the same results, the same theme. But then there are other stories where you putting it in a different location or putting it in a different time period doesn't work, right? If you think back to trifles, we learned that, you know, one of the important things about understanding the events in that play was thinking about the time period in which it took place. We take that same set of events and move them to a current time, and it's not going to play out the same way. We're not going to feel the same way about the characters necessarily, right? What is the atmosphere of the story? Sometimes with this setting comes along an atmosphere, like a mood, a vibe, right? Who narrates the story? Is it a reliable narrator? Can we trust them? You know, would the story come off differently, or would the theme be altered or maybe buried if we had a different point of view in our narrator? How does the title relate to the other elements of the story? Don't forget about the title. The title is important. Sometimes it can be a clue, right? You know, can you state the theme in a single sentence? Can you sort of narrow in on what you think the author's purpose was? And then, does their style of writing affect your interpretation, right? Is it conversational or formal? Is it familiar, unfamiliar? Is it very simple writing, or is it really like flowery, you know, ornate writing? Is it ironic or satiric, right? So all of those questions can sort of help you, if you kind of think about them in the back of your mind as you're reading each story, then you might pick up on some things along the way that by the time you finish reading the story, you'll have a better understanding of how all those elements played a part, and then how they all sort of help reveal the theme. And that is sort of what we'll be doing with each of our short stories. But let's take a look here at all of those elements a little more closely. So chapter 7 is all about structure, right? So we talked about dramatic structure, right? And when you're reading, you know, so a dramatic structure, we've got a play that often are longer plays than the one we read, but it's divided typically into scenes and acts. We read a 1-act play. There were no scene changes. It was just start to finish, there it was, right? Poetry can be divided into, we can talk about lines, we can talk about stanzas, right? And you can visually see how the poem is sort of broken into different sections. Novels right? When you read a full novel, they are broken into chapters, right? So is there anything in a short story about its structure that we need to think about? All right. In a short story, the plot itself is the main structural element. But there can be some subtle things going on with the structure that, that do provide support for the story. So first, consider the plot, right? What is the central conflict and how is it resolved? Do the events in the story move in a straight line from the beginning of the conflict to its resolution? Or are there interruptions and digressions, right? Are there flashbacks? Is time manipulated in any other way, right? Does the story have any visible structural features, such as space between sections? Or sometimes they'll even be numbered, right? And you can kind of see it is more of a visual cue that we have separations in the story, right? What do those sort of visuals represent? Is it a time shift, right? So if we've got this first section that we're reading and then there's a big space and the story continues, does that space represent a jump in time? Does the second section happen later, much later, right after? Is the second section happening before the events in the first section? Maybe that space indicates a shift in point of view. Maybe one character was our narrator in the first section, and now the second section might be from the point of view of a different character, right? So all different things that can alter the structure of the story that you need to pay attention to and think about. Not only because if you're not paying attention to the structure and it has been sort of manipulated in some way, you could end up being very confused. But let's say that, you weren't confused, you understood. We switched characters, we switched to a different time, we switched to a different location, we used a flashback. You still want to think about why the author made those choices, right? Why switch from one character's point of view to the next? Why use a flashback here? Why use a flash forward there? Why use anything involving structure? Why did the author make those choices? What does it add to the story? Instead of simply starting from the beginning and moving us through chronologically till the end. Much like dramatic structure. Remember dramatic structure, we've got point of attack. That's where the action on stage begins. Then we had our exposition where we get background information. Then we get our rising action. Now the conflict, we can feel it coming. We know something's about to happen. And then we get to the climax. And then we have our falling action. And then we have our denouement, where everything is sort of wrapped up in, in a nice, tidy little package and everybody lives happily ever after. All right. But a play has to go through that series of events because, it would get really confusing and really difficult to use flashbacks and flash forwards. And there is no point of view in a play. We're just watching it, right? So, a story can take that same structure though. A story can start and then you have your exposition and your rising action and your climax and your falling action and your denouement. Short stories and novels can absolutely take on that form. Movies take on that form, right? But we are not bound to that structure when it comes to short stories and novels and even movies. We can shift things around. If you've ever seen the movie Pulp Fiction, that was sort of one of the best examples for a long time of how, the same story gets told from different points of view. It jumps around in time. The movie Memento basically goes backwards. you know, or maybe a TV show. A TV show will use a flash forward sometimes, where the show begins at the climax, right? When the bad thing happens, or maybe right afterwards, maybe the falling action, where we start the show in the immediate aftermath, right? And we really have no idea what's going on. And then the scene will change, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen something like 48 hours earlier. And then the scene begins 48 hours earlier, and then we see the progression of events that led to that opening scene that had us confused at first. That seemed to be like, what the heck is happening? Right? So even TV shows can use structure for effect, right? Why? That's what you want to be asking. If something has occurred with the structure that is not what you expected, or not what would typically be the way of telling a story, why would the author alter that set of expected series of events? If you read a short story that uses that standard structure, right? Why did that work? Why was that the way to go, right? How does that alter how we perceive the story? All right. I think that's good for structure. I will say that the very first story that you'll read for homework, The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, structure is somewhat important in that story. Structure is somewhat important in Hills Like White Elephants as well. I won't say that either of them go against expectations, but there is something significant about the structure. The week after that, the structure for The Lottery, that actually is an interesting one because it follows standard structure, but it's interesting to think about why. Why does it follow standard structure? And then the other two stories, Everyday Use and Speech Sounds, those are pretty standard as well. All right, so we don't really get a good story from our options in the book that really messes with structure in a sort of mind-bending way. But we do have a few where it is worth considering the structure. All right, so chapter 8, all about imagery and symbolism. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this chapter at all because it is very much a repeat of what we talked about in the poetry unit in terms of imagery and symbolism. You know, you still want to think about all the different types of imagery: visual, auditory, gustatory, kinetic, thermal, and tactile. Those are going to show up in short stories as well. Now, poetry typically has to use a lot of imagery because they have such a short amount of time to get us to feel the way they want us to feel and understand what they want us to understand. Short stories have a little more time on their hands, right? So they don't necessarily have to like pummel the story with imagery, but every story we read utilizes imagery. And The Story of an Hour, imagery is huge. Hills Like White Elephants, imagery is huge. The Lottery, imagery is interesting. Everyday Use, imagery is, it's probably not as important as some of the other elements, but it is still definitely an element used in the story. And Speech Sounds, imagery is, I would say, a lesser component. So imagery kind of becomes less important in the stories as we go along. So you'll want to definitely be paying attention to the imagery in the first few stories that you'll be assigned. And remember, you know, we know images is when it paints a picture or makes us imagine something. It allows us that more immediate understanding of what's being described. All right. Remember, if a repeated image gathers significant meaning, seems to stand for something more than itself, then we might have a symbol on our hands, right? And I will say, these are the same common symbols that we looked at in the poetry unit. I will say that short stories can sometimes employ additional imagery than, not that it's not used in poetry, but you want to think about archetypal symbols, universal symbols. So these are symbols that sort of mean the same thing, no matter where you go in the world. So a circle is kind of like a symbol of wholeness and perfection all around the world. So many cultures, that symbol sort of means the same thing. The ocean or the sea is like a voyage through life. Colors often have the same symbolic meaning across cultures, right? That's important to think about. Is this a symbol just specific to the United States? Is it a symbol that would be recognized worldwide? Phallic and ionic symbols, they're sexual symbols. So a phallic symbol is suggested of male genitalia, right? So things like guns and stones, pillars, sticks, swords, knives, lollipops, cigars. It is anything that is sort of symbolic or makes you think of male genitalia, a phallus. Ionic is female genitalia, so like a flower, a cup, goblets, tunnels, rooms, right? Sort of like a vessel, pots, caves. So those are both symbols that, so phallic symbols and ionic symbols, when they're used, it is to suggest something about human sexuality. Right? We've got thinking about how do you know if something really is a symbol? Because sometimes, a cigar is just a cigar and a cup is just a cup. Remember, a symbol is something that either occurs in a significant moment or is something that is referred to multiple times, shows up, more than once in the story. So like if you have a character in the story who is smoking a cigar, that doesn't necessarily mean that the author is trying to use a phallic symbol there. But if you have a man who's smoking a cigar, another man, someone who is, sucking on a lollipop, they're fighting with like if you see multiple phallic images being used throughout the story, then you might want to pay attention and consider them symbolic in some way. But we will have symbolism in every single story that we read. If you feel like you have picked up on any phallic or ionic symbols, make sure that you share that in the assignment that you're given for that story. Because I'm interested to see what you guys think, because there are guns in one of them. There are, mention of flowers in another. And I'm always hesitant to say that they are phallic or ionic symbols, because sometimes I think people are reaching when they're looking for those kind of symbols, like they're just, and sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, a cup's just a cup, right? They're not always symbolic of these things. And I'm interested always to hear what students think. All right, so chapter 9, writing about point of view. This is our narrator, right? The person who is telling us the story, right? So we want to think about who is telling the story. Whose thoughts and feelings does the reader have access to? We might not have access to any character's thoughts and feelings because there are different points of view that can be used, different types of narrators, right? So we have first the omniscient narrator. This is the all-knowing narrator who is not a character in the story. They are not a character involved in any of the action. It is sort of just that, like the voice of God who is telling the story. But they're omniscient in that they not only see everything that's happening, but they know the thoughts and feelings of every character. And they can share that information with us, the reader. We have a limited omniscient narrator. So this character is still not a character in the story. It is still somewhat all-knowing, all-seeing, but it's limited omniscient. So they don't have access to every single character's thoughts and feelings. They only have access to probably one character's thoughts and feelings, maybe two, right? We have a first-person narrator. This is the narrator who is a character involved in the action, and they are sort of our main character because they are the ones we understand the most because they're the ones talking to us directly. They are the I in the story. So I was walking down the street, right? That is a first-person narrator. And that is typically what we're either used to an omniscient narrator or a first-person narrator. But one thing about a first-person narrator is that while it's nice to feel that immediate connection with a character, because it kind of allows us to become that character because it's in first-person point of view, and it's like we are that character now. But we're only getting their side of the story. So you have to always keep that in mind. We seem to attach very easily to a first-person narrator and just assume that everything they're telling us is actually what happened. Maybe that's not the case. They're a person, they're fallible, right? So it's interesting to think, what if this person isn't telling me the truth? Then we get to an unreliable narrator. It is when the narrator misrepresents the facts, or maybe they're crazy, right? You can't always assume that a first-person narrator is honest or sane. I can give you a great example of that is sort of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And if you've ever read that story or even seen some of the short films, and pretty much you can do this with any Edgar Allan Poe short story, but The Telltale Heart especially, that narrator is Looney Tunes, okay? So it's hard to know if anything he shares with us is factual. But even narrators that would not be like clinically insane, we as humans, our natural instinct is to make ourselves look better than what we are. And so when we're telling a story where something bad happens, we may not be totally honest about any role we might have played in that bad thing happening. We will make it seem like we are more of a hero, or that we, really didn't understand what was happening. We were just as shocked as everyone else. It's human nature to try to cover up our flaws and over exaggerate our good traits. So even a narrator who isn't necessarily crazy still might not be telling you the truth. Then we have an objective narrator. This is the narrator that is similar to an omniscient narrator in that they sort of have, they know everything that's happening, but an objective narrator has no access to the character's thoughts and feelings whatsoever. All they can do is tell us what's happening. almost like a news report in a way. It's objective. There's no thoughts or emotions getting involved in how the story is being told, right? We sadly do not have a really true, unreliable narrator in any of the stories we're reading. I guess you could question. I think it's still good to question. But we only get one story that's told in first person point of view, and that's everyday use. And what's interesting is that the characterization of that first person narrator actually makes her very trustworthy. But it's interesting, now that I'm thinking about it, you guys should really question whether Mama is reliable or unreliable. The other narrators that we have are objective, limited, omniscient, and maybe omniscient. Sadly, we don't get a really good unreliable narrator because those are fun. All right, chapter 10, setting and atmosphere. All right, so setting, of course, is the location in which the story takes place and the time in which the story takes place. And does the setting, either the location or the time, affect the story and our understanding of it in a significant way? Would the story still convey the same meaning if the setting were different? And you want to ask yourself that in a lot of these. Setting plays a huge role in the story of an hour. It plays a very interesting role in Hills Like White Elephants. It's an interesting component of the lottery. It's a very important component of everyday use. And it's a pretty darn important component of speech sounds as well. So you want to be thinking about that. Every short story we read, where and when is this story taking place? Would it be different or the same if it were told in a different time and place? And if there would be a difference, what does that tell us about how we're supposed to view this story? Right? Atmosphere. That's when the setting sort of produces an emotional effect. Hearing a tense conversation can create a tense atmosphere. Having a story where that's taking place in dark, bone-filled catacombs, that's going to create a very scary, unsettling, like you know something bad is going to happen kind of atmosphere. Let's see, an atmosphere where people are just angry and resentful creates an atmosphere. A story that takes place in an old creepy house, right? An old Southern Gothic house can create an atmosphere. And it is worth considering the atmosphere in the short stories that we're going to be reading. The setting and the structure can create a certain atmosphere in each of them. Chapter 11 is theme, writing about theme. This is what everything leads up to, right? So, what is theme? It's the central idea, the central thought, the underlying message, the general insight that the story reveals, the central truth of the story, the dominating idea of the story, an abstract concept that is made concrete through characters, structure, imagery, symbolism, point of view, and setting and atmosphere. So all of those elements that we just discussed, working together throughout the story, create and reveal the theme. The theme is not what the story is about, right? But rather a statement of ideas and values. For example, in the poetry unit, we looked at the themes for Dulce et decorum est and What Lips My Lips Have Kissed. And a lot of students, when they are asked, what's the theme of Dulce et decorum est, they will say, oh, the theme of that poem is war and soldiers dying. That's what the poem is about. That's the subject matter. That's not the theme. The theme is the underlying message, what we're supposed to walk away with, the idea, the thought, the feeling that we are supposed to walk away with after reading this piece, right? The theme of Dulce et decorum est is how we shouldn't tell young children that it is brave and heroic to die for their country in battle, because the truth is it's a nightmare. And we shouldn't encourage children to take part in that, right? That's the theme. What Lips My Lips Have Kissed? A lot of students, what is the theme of this poem? Oh, the theme is about remembering her past. That's what she does. That's what she's trying to do in the poem. That's not the theme. That's not the message that Edna St. Vincent Millay was trying to convey to us. What she's trying to convey to us, the theme is that once you have reached your golden years, there is a sadness that comes with knowing you can never regain the prime of your life. Those moments, those years have come and gone, and you can't get them back. And what's worse is sometimes you can't even remember all the details of that time. And it was your prime. It's kind of sad thing, right? So the theme, not what it's about. What is the message it is conveying? We have some other examples here, right? Okay. Your theme will be brought up with the subject, but you have to have the statement of theme with it. So ultimately, the central marriage in Romeo and Juliet ends in death, showing that this kind of passionate, irrational union cannot exist in a world fueled by hate and revenge. All right, so the statement of subject, what is Romeo and Juliet about? Ultimately, the central marriage in Romeo and Juliet ends in death. But you can't just stop there because you haven't actually revealed a theme. That's just what it's about. What is the theme? That this kind of passionate, irrational union cannot exist in a world fueled by hate and revenge. Same thing over here. In The Wizard of Oz, each of the four main characters yearn for something: a brain, a heart, courage, home, and look to others, in other words, the wizard, to provide for them, right? When all along they had it within themselves, revealing their own powers of self-sufficiency, right? So all of this right here is really just the subject, what the movie's about. And then, we have to tack on the part that actually mentions the theme, that they had the powers. They were self-sufficient, even though they didn't realize it. So you really want to make sure that you're understanding that theme is not the subject matter of the story. Theme is what we are supposed to walk away with, the lesson, the message, right? The concept, right? Some essential questions for understanding the theme. First, think about the characters. Who is the main character? Are the main characters and other characters described through dialogue, by the way they speak, right? Is there a dialect or slang that's being used, for instance? Has the author described the characters by physical appearance, by their thoughts and feelings, by their interactions with others? Are they static and flat characters who don't change? Are they dynamic round characters who do grow and change? What type of characters are they? What qualities stand out? Are they stereotypes? Are the characters believable? Answering these questions about character can help you get closer to the theme. Think about the structure. What is the most important event? What is the climax? How is the plot structured? Is it linear and chronological? Does it move all around? Do we have sort of any kind of flashback? Does the structure mimic anything? Is the plot believable? Think about imagery and symbolism. Is there a lot of figurative language being used? What about the imagery? Are there moments of imagery, and what is it being used for? How is it being employed in the story? Is there symbolism? Are there metaphors, similes? Right? Think about all the things we talked about with poetry. Think about the point of view. Who is the narrator of the story? Are we speaking through a main character, first person point of view? Do we have a limited omniscient, a full omniscient, objective? Right? You're going to run into a variety of narrators in these short stories. There's a reason why the author chose that type of narrator. Think about that. Think about the setting and the atmosphere, when and where the story takes place. How does that affect our understanding of it? Would it matter? Could it be changed to a different time and place and still pretty much be the same? Or is there something about the when and where that makes a difference? Okay. Think about the bigger picture. What real life issues are reflected in the text? What is the author saying about these issues? What point is the author trying to make by writing this story? What does this story tell us about how people behave? What does it tell us about how society affects individuals? What does it tell us about the relationship between people and nature? What does it tell us about right and wrong or good and evil? Those types of questions, thinking about the bigger picture, is what will help lead you to the theme in light of structure, point of view, setting and atmosphere, imagery and symbolism. All of those things together and asking these types of questions will lead you to the theme, right? And that is what we will be doing with these short stories. Now, you're going to be assigned 2 short stories this week, The Story of an Hour and Hills Like White Elephants. The assignment is a few basic questions about each story. And this will be the same for the remaining 3 short stories as well. Basic questions, just to A, make sure you've actually read the story, and B, just to sort of get you to think about some things, right? But it's very general, basic questions. Kind of like the trifles assignment was, right? I did not ask you to any super deep, complicated questions about that play in the homework assignment. I waited for the follow-up lesson to get into some of the deeper things about the play. Same with these short stories. You're going to read a story and answer a few basic general questions. And then the following week, I will provide a lesson that goes into the story much deeper. Every lesson will look at that story's structure, that story's point of view, that story's setting and atmosphere, that story's imagery and symbolism, and that story's theme. Your homework assignment is not going to mention any of those elements. You're not going to be asked what type of narrator is being used, what type of point of view, how does structure affect the story? What is the setting? How does it affect the story? You're not going to be asked any of those kind of questions on the homework assignments. Homework, very basic, general questions, just to make sure that you have actually read the story and that you have a basic understanding of what was going on. So I don't want you to feel like you have to know and understand all these elements when you read it on your own. No, you'll get all of that in the follow-up lesson the next week. When it comes time to do the short stories exam in week 10, then yes, by that point, you'll need to understand how all of these elements play into the theme of each story. But that's all going to come from the follow-up lesson. So read each short story. Do your best to answer those very basic questions, okay? You'll get everything you need the following week. And I really only think there's one story that tends to be a little confusing and difficult for students, and it is the one of them that you'll read this week. Hills Like White Elephants, not an easy story to understand. I think students understand the basics, like they know like something's happening, but it's really difficult to understand the big picture and exactly what is going on. And that's okay. It's supposed to be a hard one. You'll get the information the following week. But the other stories, I don't think they're not that difficult. You're going to understand the basics. So trust that, answer the questions, and then you'll get everything you need the following week. Okay? But this is what we'll be looking for. We're going to be looking at all of these different elements that were covered here in chapters 6 through 11, and, seeing how all of them work differently in each story to reveal each story's unique theme. Okay? All right. So that's it for this week. If you have questions or, run into any problems, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, you're free to move on to the next thing.